Have you ever wondered what happens when the generations before us, who've always given so much, finally need support themselves? Are we truly doing enough to show our appreciation for everything they've sacrificed? In today's video, we'll dive into the emotional stories of two elderly women, Mrs. Lee and Mrs. Lon, whose journeys through family challenges and personal growth will make you rethink the way we care for our parents and grandparents. You'll discover how Mrs. Lee, after years of selflessness, learned the hard way that her happiness and well-being mattered too. You'll also hear about Mrs. Lon, who silently shouldered the burden of caregiving for years until a life-altering event made her family realize just how much she had given. But that's not all. We'll also explore the deep emotional lessons these stories teach about family dynamics, the unspoken struggles of the elderly, and how even the most loving relationships can become strained when appreciation and boundaries are overlooked. If you've ever questioned how to balance family duty with personal fulfillment, or wondered how to truly support aging loved ones, this video is a must-watch. By the end, you'll be equipped with important insights on improving relationships with your parents and loved ones, while learning how to honor their sacrifices without losing yourself in the process. So, stay tuned as we explore how love, sacrifice, and the need for self-care all intertwine in the lives of the elderly. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. First, money. Mrs. Wong was overjoyed when she heard the news that her daughter-in-law had given birth to twins. There's something so incredibly special about grandchildren, and the arrival of these two little bundles of joy brought warmth and excitement to her heart. In her mind, these tiny angels needed all the care and attention in the world, and as any loving grandmother would, she immediately began to prepare herself to lend a helping hand. Without hesitation, she packed her bags and made plans to visit her son and his new family, eager to support them during those early, often overwhelming days of parenthood. For a few months, everything seemed fine. Mrs. Wong and her husband poured their love and energy into caring for the babies, hoping to give their son and daughter-in-law some much-needed respite. But as time passed, things began to unravel. Mrs. Wong, like any parent or grandparent, wanted to make sure her grandchildren had the best start in life, especially knowing how expensive it could be to raise twins. She and her husband had saved every penny over the years, and she thought it only natural to share those savings with their son to help him through the financial strain. It was, after all, what any loving parent would do for their child in times of need. However, in what seemed like no time at all, a series of misunderstandings and disagreements began to arise between Mrs. Wong and her son. The daily routines, the small details, the differences in child-rearing philosophies, these things began to clash, and the warmth that once filled their home was replaced by tension and frustration. What had started as a selfless act of love slowly turned into something else, something Mrs. Wong had never imagined, the unraveling of a relationship she had always cherished. The arguments became more frequent, and the stress began to take its toll on Mrs. Wong and her husband. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about something much deeper: trust, respect, and family. In the end, after months of trying to hold it all together, Mrs. Wong and her husband decided they needed to return home. But when they looked at their savings, the life savings they had worked so hard for, that had been carefully accumulated over the years, they discovered that it was no longer there. Their son had used it all, just as he said he would, to buy a house and a car and take care of the children. But Mrs. Wong couldn't help but feel heartbroken, betrayed. Her son, who she had raised with so much care, was now treating their savings as though it was his to keep. What was once an act of love had turned into an emotional burden they couldn't escape. Her son justified his actions by saying that raising a family was incredibly expensive and that the money was a loan he would pay back over time. Mrs. Wong understood that life for her son wasn't easy. It never was, and it never would be. But she couldn't help but feel that her own life, too, had its struggles. As you grow older, your health can deteriorate unexpectedly, and the need for a safety net becomes more pressing. The comfort and security that retirement funds bring are not just about the ability to relax, but also about protecting yourself against life's uncertainties. She realized that, while parents should always strive to support their children, there comes a time when you need to protect your future, too. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Mrs. Wang's heart ached as she looked back at her decisions. Giving your children a helping hand is an act of love, yes, but it's important to remember the balance. The balance between love for your children and love for yourself. Financial support is essential, but giving away everything you have, without consideration for your own needs, can lead to regret. No one tells you this as a parent, but as you grow older, you begin to see the truth. There's no guarantee that you will always be around to help, and as hard as it is to accept, there will come a time when you have to think of yourself first. Mrs. Wang's story is a poignant reminder. Parents can give, but they must also hold back enough to safeguard their well-being. The reality of aging can be difficult to face, but it's a reality that comes for us all. And as painful as it may be to admit, we must learn to cherish not just the love we give, but also the love we need to reserve for ourselves. Second, housing. For many elderly individuals, the decision to sell their homes and move in with their children seems like a hopeful step toward care, support, and the closeness of family. The idea is heartwarming. The elderly can be surrounded by loved ones, and their children have the chance to reciprocate the care they once received. However, the reality of living together doesn't always match the expectations, and the consequences can be deeply painful and often unexpected. The truth is that sharing a household can quickly ignite family conflicts. Differences in lifestyle, habits, and routines can create tension in what should be a safe and loving space. The elderly may feel their independence slipping away, and with it, their sense of dignity. They may long for the solitude and personal freedom they once had, yet feel trapped in a situation where privacy is compromised. On the other hand, the children, who may have the best intentions, can become overwhelmed by the demands of caregiving. The pressure of managing their own family, career, and now the responsibility of caring for elderly parents can result in stress, frustration, and resentment. This delicate balance of love, duty, and expectation often leads to conflict, and in some cases, it can even tear relationships apart. The following story is one such heartbreaking example of how things can go wrong when elderly parents put their trust in their children's care. It's the story of an elderly couple who, after dedicating their lives to providing for their son, found themselves coldly rejected, all because they wanted to give their child a home that they hoped would be full of love, warmth, and gratitude. My husband and I didn't have our son until we were both in our late 30s. We were so thrilled when he was born, and he became the center of our world. 4 years, we worked tirelessly, giving him everything we could. Our dream was to see him grow into a good man, build a career, find a loving partner, and build his own family. But life doesn't always follow the script we expect. At 24, my son married his girlfriend after she got pregnant, and everything changed. We were far from wealthy, and our home was modest, just enough for our small family. But when my son and his wife asked us to tear down our old house and build a new one, we couldn't say no. They didn't have the money, so my husband and I gave them everything we could, every last penny from our savings, along with money we borrowed from the bank. It was a sacrifice, but we thought it was worth it. We were happy to support their future together. But things didn't turn out the way we imagined. With the new house built, it was as though a switch had flipped. My daughter-in-law, who had once been so sweet, began to change. She became increasingly irritable and unreasonable. Small things set her off, and before long, the tension was unbearable. The occasional arguments between my daughter-in-law and me were to be expected. After all, that's a normal part of family life. But things started to escalate. My son, who once had been so loving and respectful, became hostile and defensive. Every disagreement seemed to end with him yelling at me, saying that he couldn't tolerate the stress I was causing in their home. The final straw came one afternoon when I was looking after their children. While preparing their bottles, I accidentally spilled some milk on the floor. It was a simple mistake, one that could happen to anyone. But when my daughter-in-law came home and saw the spilled milk, she exploded in anger. She accused me of being irresponsible and dirty and even suggested that I had intentionally wasted her child's milk. I tried to explain what had happened, but she wouldn't listen. Instead, she started crying and ran to tell my son. My heart sank. When my son came home, he didn't even ask for my side of the story. His anger flared immediately, and he said something I will never forget. "Since you're staying at our house, you need to be considerate. If you keep making me angry, I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." At that moment, I felt a sharp pain deep in my chest. All those years of sacrifice, all that love and support, and this was how they repaid us. A lifetime of care and commitment, just thrown away. I had hoped for a loving home where we could all be together, but instead, I found myself being cast aside like a burden. It was devastating. The dream of living with my son, of being close to him and his family in our old age, felt more like a nightmare than anything else. I couldn't help but feel that in their eyes, I had become nothing more than a nuisance. This is a story all too familiar for many elderly parents. The sacrifices they make for their children often go unnoticed, and their love, which is meant to be a source of comfort, is met with impatience and resentment. It's a heartbreaking reality that too many seniors face when they choose to live with their children, believing that it will lead to mutual care and support. Instead, they often find themselves isolated, their independence stripped away, and their sense of dignity eroded by the very people they once trusted to take care of them. It's a painful reminder that love and sacrifice are not always enough, and sometimes, the consequences of these decisions can be more devastating than they could have ever imagined. I was devastated by my son's words. After all these years of raising him, loving him, and sacrificing everything for him, now that we're old and vulnerable, I'm suddenly treated like a burden. The look in his eyes, the coldness, the lack of empathy. It was as if all those years of care and devotion meant nothing. I felt shattered and utterly disheartened, and it was as though a part of me had died at that moment. I thought about everything I'd given. My time, my energy, my whole life dedicated to raising him, and now, in my old age, this is how we're treated. It was hard to accept. The pain was so raw. I couldn't even fathom how it all went so wrong. How did we go from being his parents, the people he once cared about, to being discarded like old furniture? When I spoke to my husband about it, we both agreed something had to change. We couldn't continue living in a situation where we were so unwanted, so disrespected. It broke my heart to think that our son and daughter-in-law could look at us that way, but in the end, we decided we had no choice but to leave. We couldn't stay under the same roof with someone who treated us so callously, and it seemed like the only way to regain some sense of dignity and peace. So, my husband and I decided to move out. We rented a small place for ourselves, but even that felt so wrong. Over 60 years old, and this is what our life had come to? We had given everything to our children, all our property, and now, when we had nothing left, they just turned their backs on us. It was heartbreaking and soul-crushing. I could still remember the days when my son, before he was married, used to be so caring and thoughtful. He would listen to me, spend time with me, and show real affection. But once he married, everything changed. His wife was his world, and we, his parents, seemed to fade into the background, mere afterthoughts. It was as though they saw us as nothing but an inconvenience. They fought with us, argued with us, and ultimately kicked us out of the house we had worked so hard to build. For over a month, I couldn't sleep, and I wouldn't find any peace. My thoughts consumed me. I would lie awake at night, wondering how we had ended up in this painful, lonely situation. My heart ached, and my spirit was crushed by the realization that our flesh and blood no longer cared for us. It was a betrayal that hurt beyond words. Then my daughter-in-law, with her cold, indifferent tone, said something that stung me to the core. "You should have moved out a long time ago." I was speechless. Over 60 years old, and instead of enjoying our later years, we were forced to rent a place, to start over again from nothing. The anger, the sadness, the feeling of being abandoned, it was too much. We had given them everything, and now they didn't even care enough to keep us close. It was like our lives, all the sacrifices, meant nothing to them. It was devastating. But we didn't give up. My husband and I decided to take control of our future. We hadn't yet transferred the land title to them, and that small glimmer of hope was all we had left. I had seen so many similar stories in the news of parents being mistreated by their children, and I promised myself I wouldn't be one of those people who just accepted being pushed aside. The house, the land, it was ours, and we were going to take it back. The battle was long and painful. My son was stunned, horrified, when he saw his wife fighting with us, his parents. But it was too late. We were done being silent. We called on relatives to help us, and we demanded what was rightfully ours: the house, the land, and compensation for everything we had spent to build the life we had worked for. The sum we asked for, 250 million VND, included the 100 million VND we had poured into the house, buying materials, labor, and everything else. We hadn't signed over the land, so we knew we had the right to claim it back. It wasn't just a financial victory, it was a victory of dignity, of self-respect. 4 years, my son had shown no interest in caring for us. But now, my husband and I were standing up for ourselves, and it felt like we were reclaiming our lives. We used my husband's pension, plus the extra work he picked up, to pay off our debts. We couldn't afford to stay in the rented house, but we dared to take back what was ours. I don't regret it, not for a single moment. We built that house with our own hands, and we weren't going to let anyone erase that. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Now, my husband and I live in a small house with a little garden, surrounded by relatives and, most importantly, our grandchildren. It's a simple life, but it's a good life. We spend our old age together, finding joy in the small things, and cherishing the love we still have. As for our son and daughter-in-law, let them live their lives as they wish. I've learned that sometimes you have to let go of the things you thought were important, and focus on what matters: your peace, your happiness, and the love that remains. Third, Mrs. Lee is a typical example of an elderly person. Mrs. Lee is a poignant example of the challenges and emotional complexities that many elderly individuals face in their later years. At 70, she lives in Suzhou, China, a city steeped in history and beauty, yet behind the tranquil scenery, her life is far from simple. Mrs. Lee is a proud mother, deeply devoted to her daughter, the joy of her life. 4 years, she poured her heart into her family, working tirelessly to provide, nurturing her children with love, and sacrificing her dreams for their well-being. She never imagined that, in her old age, she would be caught in a painful emotional web with the very person she had poured so much into. It all began when her daughter gave birth to a son. At first, Mrs. Lee was overjoyed by the thought of having a grandson. She eagerly took on the role of caregiver, believing that this would be the golden chapter of her life. She imagined herself delighting in the sounds of a child's laughter, reminiscing about the days when she cared for her daughter. Yet, life had other plans. The reality of taking care of a baby, especially in her later years, proved to be far more demanding than she had anticipated. The constant crying, the sleepless nights, the worry over sickness, it all became overwhelming. She had hoped for joy, but instead, she found herself drowning in exhaustion and self-doubt. What made the situation even more heartbreaking for Mrs. Lee was the way her daughter responded. Rather than showing gratitude for her sacrifices, her daughter seemed to dismiss her struggles. There were moments when she became frustrated with Mrs. Lee over trivial matters, as if everything should have been effortless for the elderly woman. The coldness and lack of empathy from the very person she had devoted her life to left Mrs. Lee feeling deeply alone. It was as though the bond they once shared was crumbling right before her eyes. The emotional weight of this was crushing. Mrs. Lee had spent her entire life believing that love, sacrifice, and family were the unshakable foundation of her world. But here she was, not only unappreciated but also blamed for not meeting expectations that felt impossible. In the darkest moments, her daughter even threatened to sever their relationship, further deepening Mrs. Lee's sense of betrayal and abandonment. This heartbreaking realization was a wake-up call for Mrs. Lee, forcing her to confront a harsh truth. To live a fulfilled life, she could no longer rely solely on her family. She had to find strength within herself, reclaim her independence, and rediscover her happiness. So, Mrs. Lee made the courageous decision to focus on herself. She began prioritizing her health, her well-being, and her joy. No longer would she be tethered to the demands of family life at the cost of her soul. She started engaging in activities that brought her fulfillment, joining social clubs, making new friends, and even exploring new hobbies that had once been forgotten. Slowly, she began to rediscover a sense of purpose and joy that had long been buried under the weight of duty and sacrifice. It was in this period of self-reflection and renewal that Mrs. Lee began to find peace again. As time passed, her daughter, overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, began to understand the depth of her mother's sacrifices. She recognized that her mother had not only given up her happiness but had also carried a heavy emotional burden for the sake of her family. The realization prompted a heartfelt apology. Her daughter acknowledged her faults, and with time, their relationship began to heal. They grew closer, more compassionate, and more appreciative of each other. Mrs. Lee's journey of self-discovery and healing ultimately brought about a reconciliation that was both deeply emotional and transformative for them both. Mrs. Lee's story serves as a powerful reminder that the love between family members requires more than just sacrifice. It demands mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation. It's a love that should be nurtured, not taken for granted. The elderly, who have given so much to their families, deserve to be seen, heard, and cared for in return. The emotional and mental well-being of our elders should not be overlooked, for they have already given us so much. Their sacrifices, often silent and unseen, deserve recognition and gratitude. This lesson extends beyond Mrs. Lee. In our own lives, we must reflect on the way we treat our parents, especially as they age. They have spent their lives supporting us, and in their later years, it is our turn to offer them the same kindness, understanding, and love. Our parents should not feel like burdens but should instead experience the warmth of family, the joy of companionship, and the sense of belonging that they have long given us. In a small village not too far from Mrs. Lee's home, Mrs. Lon, an elderly woman over 70, faces a similar struggle. She lives with her son Min, his wife, and their 2 young children. Nam and Min and his wife are hard-working individuals, often stretching themselves thin to provide for their family. As a result, the bulk of the caregiving for the grandchildren falls on Mrs. Lan's shoulders. Much like Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Lon had hoped to enjoy a peaceful retirement, but instead, she found herself once again sacrificing her own needs for the sake of her family. While her dedication to her grandchildren is commendable, it too comes at a cost: her health, her happiness, and her sense of self. It is a situation that highlights the need for balance in family life, where the elderly are supported, appreciated, and given the space to care for themselves as they care for others. Mrs. Lee and Mrs. Lan's stories are a testament to the complexity of aging, family dynamics, and the deep emotional currents that run through our lives. They remind us that as our loved ones grow older, they too have needs and desires. Needs that go beyond physical care. They need love, understanding, and the recognition that their lives are valuable, not just for what they can give, but for who they are. As children, we must remember this, for the warmth of family is built on mutual respect and support, and the true beauty of love is found in the way we honor and care for each other, no matter the stage of life. Every morning, As the first light of dawn peeks through the curtains, Mrs. Lon awakens, already thinking about the day's responsibilities. With unwavering dedication, she gets up and prepares a hearty breakfast for her entire family, setting the tone for a new day filled with care. After the morning meal, she doesn't stop. She takes her two beloved grandchildren to school, a task she does with a loving smile despite the fatigue she feels creeping in. Then, as if the day hasn't already been long enough, she returns to her home to tackle the never-ending list of household chores, sweeping, scrubbing, and organizing with a tireless spirit. In the afternoon, she's right back on her feet, picking up the children, helping them with their homework, and then starting to prepare dinner, always making sure everything is perfect. When the grandchildren fall ill, it's she who is there by their side, soothing them through their fevers, and making sure they eat, sleep, and recover. She worries over every small detail because, to her, their happiness and well-being are everything. But as the years pass, Mrs. Land's body begins to show the toll of this selfless routine. The constant movement, the endless cycle of caregiving, and the relentless strain of putting her own needs aside for others all start to wear her down. She becomes more and more fatigued with each passing day, but, out of love for her family, she presses on without complaint, feeling that it's her duty, her place, to continue giving. And despite her exhaustion, she never once says a word of protest. Min and his wife, who have always been busy with their work, begin to notice the change. They see their mother growing more and more tired, but the weight of their responsibilities blinds them to how badly she needs a break. They can see she's running on fumes, but their lives are so demanding that they fail to truly see the extent of her sacrifice. It's not until one evening while preparing yet another meal for the family that disaster strikes. Mrs. Lon collapses in the kitchen, overcome by exhaustion. Panic sets in as the family rushes her to the hospital, hearts racing with fear and guilt. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. The doctor's diagnosis is a harsh wake-up call: severe exhaustion. Mrs. Lon is told she needs complete rest, something that, in all her years of selflessness, she has never truly allowed herself. Min and his wife are left reeling with regret, realizing that they have allowed their mother to carry the weight of the family for far too long, without stepping in to ease her burden. When Mrs. Lon is finally discharged from the hospital, her children and grandchildren rally around her, making sure she rests and recovers. Min, overcome with remorse, decides to hire a domestic helper to take over the household chores that had so deeply drained his mother. This event becomes a turning point for the entire family. Min and his wife begin to reassess their priorities. They start to make time not just for their work, but for their children, and most importantly, for Mrs. Lon. They realize that their mother has lived her life giving so much of herself, and now it's time for her to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Mrs. Lon, for the first time in years, is encouraged to step outside her home and engage in activities that nourish her soul. She joins a senior club, where she can meet friends and take part in exercises that keep her body moving and her spirits lifted. The family watches with a sense of relief as they see her smile again, more relaxed and happy than they've seen her in a long time. This transformation becomes a lesson for all of them. The sacrifices of the elderly, especially those made for their children and grandchildren, are invaluable. But those sacrifices should never come at the cost of their health or happiness. A family built on love and respect should never be one where the elders are expected to give endlessly without taking the time to care for themselves. Health, after all, is not a gift. It is a foundation that benefits not only the elderly but their entire family. Parents and grandparents need to understand that their well-being is essential to the happiness of the family as a whole. As people age, time seems to slip away faster, and the moments we once took for granted become precious treasures. Yet, so many parents, out of love and duty, spend this limited time caring for others, cooking, cleaning, and sacrificing their desires to help their children and grandchildren. They put their own needs and rest on the back burner, as though their happiness is secondary. This not only wastes the remaining years they have but can also erode their health, leaving them vulnerable to illness and burnout. What's often forgotten is that good health is not just a stroke of luck for the elderly, but a crucial investment in their future, and the future of their loved ones. So, why not allow ourselves, as parents or grandparents, to step back and enjoy the life we've earned? Why not embrace the freedom to rest, join social activities, and live for ourselves in ways we may have neglected in the past? The truth is that elf sacrifice, while admirable, is not sustainable. In today's world, we must recognize that, before they became parents, our elders were independent individuals with their dreams, desires, and needs. They, too, deserve the chance to nurture those aspects of themselves. Family life should be one where mutual care, respect, and understanding flourish, where the older generation can enjoy life without feeling like they must give everything away, leaving themselves with nothing in return. And that's the key: learning to take care of ourselves, finding joy in what we love, and making space for happiness, even in our later years. Only then can we truly feel the fullness of life. As we reflect on Mrs. Land's story, we see how easy it is to lose ourselves in the care of others, especially when we love them deeply. Her selflessness, her unspoken sacrifices, and the quiet strength with which she has carried her family for years are truly inspiring. But through her journey, we also learn that we mustn't forget to take care of ourselves, too. Health, happiness, and self-care aren't luxuries. They're essentials for everyone, especially those who give so much to others. Now, after hearing Mrs. Land's story, I want to ask you, what have you learned from her experience? Is there one thing you'll take away and begin to practice in your own life? Maybe it's taking a moment for yourself, or being more mindful of the elderly in your life. Whatever it is, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share one thing you've learned and we'll start applying to your life in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave a comment, hit that like button, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.